You're listening to the Rob Call Bottom Up Show, available on Pacifica Radio Network, Progressive Radio Networks, iHeartRadio, iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and opednews.com/podcasts. I'm Rob Call, host of the show, which explores how we're transitioning from a top-down to a bottom-up culture and how to think about bottom-up. I've written a book, The Bottom-Up Revolution. Find out about it at robcall.com. My guest for this show is Marjorie Kelly. She's the Executive Vice President and Senior Fellow at the Democracy Collaborative. She co-founded Business Ethics Magazine. She's got a new book out, The Making of a Democratic Economy, Building Prosperity for the Many, Not Just the Few. Great to have you back. You were here about 4 years ago on the show to talk about your previous books. What are those titles?
Yeah, the first book, Rob, was The Divine Right of Capital, which came out in 2001. And the second book was Owning Our Future, which was 2012, I think.
You're doing great work. Democracy Collaborative is doing great work. And you've got this new book out, The Making of a Democratic Economy.
Mm-hmm.
You're continuing to work on the same ideas, and you're fine-tuning them. You're spreading them around, and you've got something really exciting happening. So let's start out. Just tell us, what is a democratic economy?
Yeah, it's a great place to start, Rob. We could start by saying what it's not. It's not the extractive economy that we have today, which is designed for maximum financial extraction by the few, mostly by, you can call it an economy of buying for the 1%. So a democratic economy is what's beginning to emerge in experiments all over, much more numerous than most of us realize. It's an economy that's designed for all of us. And it's an economy of buying for the people, recognizes and honors planetary boundaries, and is designed for broad-based prosperity, which is different than just trying to regulate the economy that we have and wrapping it around with social safety nets or regulations, but instead saying, no, from its DNA, from the inside out, it should be designed for broad-based prosperity. That's a democratic economy.
I like the comparison you make to trying to modify the existing system we have as like having barnacles on a whale, adding barnacles on a whale, trying to add regulations. What you're really saying is we've got to change the system.
Right. We've got to change the system. And we have to recognize, everybody knows inequality is a problem today. People say the 1% have too much. But what isn't so widely recognized is where in the design that mandate lies. What holds it in place? And you're right. So if you just put barnacles on the side of the whale, it doesn't change the nature of the whale. It has to get into the DNA.
And you talk about systems.
Mm-hmm.
I love systems theory. So talk about how systems fit into your vision of a change in our economic system.
You know, I worked for a number of years at the Tellus Institute, which is a think tank founded by some physicists. And they talked a lot about systems thinking. And it's a kind of a language that I learned. And you talk about it in your book, also, The Bottom-Up Revolution. So systems thinking tells us, first of all, that there's no such thing as separate systems. There's really one system, and essentially in our sphere, it's the Earth. The Earth is the one system, and everything else is a subset of that. Which is very different than the idea that the capitalist system has, which is that capital is the center of the universe, and maximizing capital and giving power to capital is the center, and everything else is used instrumentally in service of that goal. But one of the lovely things about systems thinking is it talks about emergence, and you talk about this in your book too, Rob, that we have this idea that change is linear. You do a little bit of this, you do a little bit more, and the graph kind of climbs up towards something. But what systems science tells us is that living systems are nonlinear. They don't proceed in these straight lines that we project. Our investment portfolios don't proceed in these straight lines that we project. That there can be perturbations in the system. There can be strange attractors. There's this wonderful language, but small interventions can cause a large change. And what you can see is what's called emergence, that when systems become chaotic and they become disturbed and unpredictable, they can flip into a new order, a higher order of being. They can also break down. But it is possible to have this spontaneous emergence of new forms of order, and that's what's called emergence. And I think that's what we're seeing now with the various experiments in the democratic economy. People know what needs to happen, and these spontaneous new forms of order are emerging.
There's a story I relate in my book about bamboo.
Uh-huh.
And I think it applies to activism. With bamboo, you can water it for a year or two and nothing happens. And then all of a sudden, it grows 10, 20 feet in a matter of weeks or months.
I loved that story. That's awesome. Right. It seems like nothing's happening. And then all of a sudden, huge change is happening. Someone else put it this way. They said that social change often or for years can feel like things are happening much more slowly than you want. And then all of a sudden, a moment can occur when things are happening much more fast, much more rapidly than you thought was possible.
And the other thing is that you never know if the effort that you're making is going to make a huge difference because of who it touches and what other systems and elements within the system it influences. And that's how this emergence can produce profound effects where you don't need 50% plus one at all.
Right. We've seen that, Rob, with our organization, the Democracy Collaborative. We helped design and start the Evergreen Cooperatives in Cleveland. And this is 3 employee-owned companies. They're fed by contracts from large anchor institutions like Cleveland Clinic brings its laundry there. So there's a commercial laundry, there's a greenhouse and so forth. And they hire their formerly incarcerated, and it's in downtown Cleveland. Well, these have maybe 200 employees, which is not small, but it's certainly not world-changing. And yet, this model has inspired so many people. There are cities around the country who are trying to do something similar. In Preston, England, was inspired by this. They discovered it on the internet and tried something similar, and it created a much larger and more expansive model in this Rust Belt city of Preston, England, which has in turn inspired the entire UK. And the Labour Party has created a unit within it called the Community Wealth Building Unit, which is building on this. That's the form of economic development the term of art that we use. And there are more than 60 cities have approached Preston and say, we want to do something similar to what you're doing. So yes, you don't really know how what you're doing can inspire others. And it's something that people are looking for.
And when I think of your books that I know of, this book kind of takes the ideas that you've espoused and talked about in the past, and it gives concrete examples of different places in the world where they're actually being put into effect with fabulous success.
Yeah, you're right, Rob. I work at a nonprofit as an executive now, but my background is as a journalist. And so I always want to tell the stories of real people, including all the complexities of that. And so, yes, it's intended to be a very accessible book. It's a short read. I had an artist, she said, read it in one sitting. But yeah, each chapter we go and we visit a real place and some real people who are doing this work. For example, Matthew Brown in Preston is one of the chapters. And we look there at how you can really build a politics around this, which is happening in the UK. Jeremy Corbyn could well be the next prime minister there. We'll see.
Well, wait, what's the connection between Corbyn and Preston?
Matthew Brown, who's a city councillor in Preston, is the person who built out the Preston model, as it's being called. And he is now advising Jeremy Corbyn. And Corbyn has a community wealth building unit. And so Corbyn has basically taken up the Preston model and says, we want to do this across the UK. Yeah.
Now, in the UK, they've got inclusive ownership funds. And then here in the US, Elizabeth Warren is talking about accountable capitalism. Talk about that, because I think that ties in here, right?
Yeah. One of the things that we talk about in the book is, how does change go from small scale models to large scale change. And we saw this in the time of the Depression and in the first New Deal. You had farmers gathered together cooperatives. They were trying to survive with the emergence of these large companies. And so they gathered together and formed farmer cooperatives. And you had in Alaska, a state, you had old people going hungry. The state decided to give aid to elder people. And these were the kinds of small-scale examples gave rise to Social Security and the Tennessee Valley Authority and the whole farm structure, which is quite substantial in the federal government in the U.S. Farm support structure, there's a lot of support in the U.S. government for farmers, including paying them to not plant and loan systems and banks. CoBank is one of the most stable large banks in the country, and it's entirely owned by farmers and cooperatives. So there's a whole farm support infrastructure that has grown up in the U.S. and it began with these small scale models.
Okay.
So you started to ask about Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders and some of their proposals. So I think what we're seeing right now, Rob, is there have been for decades, certainly for years, there have been small scale experiments of various kinds. And for example, B corporations. B corporations have been invented probably in the last decade or so, and there's now a couple of thousands of them around the country.
What's a B corporation?
Yeah, these are mostly small companies that adopt into their bylaws and articles. They say, we don't exist to maximize profits. We want to create social benefit. And we're taking that so seriously, we're going to put it into our governing documents. That's the DNA we're talking about, and we're going to report on our outcomes and be measured on that, publicly report. It's a voluntary certification process. There's also incorporation statutes to do something very similar in the laws of 34 states, benefit corporations that adopt a governing framework in state law. So this is an idea that has come up on the voluntary side. There are some large companies, it's mostly small companies, but okay, so you take that little idea and then you say, okay, Elizabeth Warren has proposed the Accountable Capitalism Act. And what it says is that if you're a company with over $1 billion in revenue, you are no longer going to have a state charter, you're going to have a federal charter. And you're going to be required to serve stakeholders, not just stockholders, but also the community, employees, the environment. And you're going to have employees, representatives on the board. So see, you can take an idea that companies need to have in their DNA, this idea of public benefit, as well as producing profit for the survival of the company and serving shareholders. But you're going to have this mandate to create public benefit. And that's an example of how small examples can then become potentially national policy.
And there's also one like that either happening in England or they're working on.
Well, okay, so that's getting at the issue of corporate purpose and
inclusive ownership funds.
Right. And so then the other lever you can pull is that of ownership. And this is what we talk a lot about at the Democracy Collaborative as well. And that is, yes, Jeremy Corbyn in the UK has put forward this idea of inclusive ownership funds, saying that companies every year will be required to give 1% of equity into an employee trust, and that up to about 10%. And that employees then would benefit just like any shareholder would from that ownership stake. Bernie Sanders wants to do something in the U.S. Very similar. He wants to go up to 20%. 1% a year is not at all onerous. Chief executives tend to run off with that much and more.
I was thinking that they could do the same thing with returning to the commons assets like real estate assets and property assets and creative copyright assets and patents and things like that.
You're right. Ownership is really the root issue in our economy, Rob. It took me many years to see that when I was the president and publisher of Business Ethics magazine. I watched socially responsible companies get sold to multinationals and then lose their social mission over time as new owners came in and put a new purpose in place, which was to maximize gains for shareholders. So I came to see that capital is the controlling force and it's ownership that allows them to be in control. And so, how do you shift ownership in our economy from the few to the many. Well, there's lots of ways to do it. There's lots of ways to design ownership. You're talking about land and the commons, right? So you can have commons ownership. For example, in Maine, I talked about this in my second book, Owning Our Future. In Maine, they have a whole infrastructure in place that says only owner-occupied boats can fish for lobster in the sensitive inshore waters, small boats basically, and the big corporate trawlers can only go offshore. And lobster fishermen have basically territories that the different ones control, and the state is helping to honor that. So,
and that's a very bottom-up concept.
It's a very bottom-up concept, and there's kind of a commons. It's like, how are we going to govern ourselves in this common space, which is the ocean and the shore, so that there's maximum benefit? And it's been actually very beneficial for lobster. So you're right. There's lots of forms of ownership. And like land, we talk about that at the Democracy Collaborative. For example, you can have community land trusts in cities, and this is growing, where you have people still own their homes, and yet the community or a nonprofit will own the land beneath the homes. So what that does is that reduces the price of a house, so it makes it affordable. And you can still sell it. You can still enjoy some growth in its value. And yet it lowers and stabilizes the price of homes. And community land trusts in the 2008 meltdown, they had foreclosure rates 1/10 the rate of traditional mortgages. So these are stable forms that are broadly beneficial.
I'm always interested in kind of the anthropological perspective on stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So, you wrote a book about ownership. What about the prehistory, the anthropology or history of ownership?
Mm-hmm.
What can you tell us about?
Sure. Yeah, you talk about that a lot in your book, Rob, and I thought that was fascinating. I agree with a lot of what you said. A very simple way I like to say it is ownership is a very intuitive concept, not only to humans, but to animals. I mean, in animals, it's called territory, right? There's the marking of territory. There's the claiming of territories. It's a really innate drive. A 2-year-old knows the concept of mine. And so this notion of ownership, I mean, some people, I used to think, well, maybe we should just get rid of ownership and everybody owns everything. And I think that was somewhat of the impulse of behind communism. But I think that that's not the way it's going to go. I think that's not going to work because this impulse is so innate. And so I think our challenge is to tame ownership, to kind of redesign it to allow it to become stewardship, which is different. Yes, and you talk in your book about how in ancient times there were matrilineal societies, and certainly in indigenous societies, they didn't have so much a sense of ownership, but more a sense of kinship. We did some work in Native American communities, particularly Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. And I was blessed to work with a number of Lakota Sioux, and they've actually taken our work on community wealth building and translated it into Lakota. And they talk in this report that we put out that I helped to edit. They talk about how, that it wasn't, you're kin to all living things. That's very different than owning them, although there is this sense of belonging to the land and being part of it. And I think that that's more what we need to get back to.
I've tried to expose myself to Native American thinking, and that's what it is. They are a part of the land.
Right.
It's not like they own it. They are connected to it.
I think that's right, Rob. And I think our challenge is to sort of go through the modern era and these modern forms that we have, which are not going to go away. We're not going to stop owning our houses, for example. But, and to move through that into this concept of stewardship and kinship and somehow integrate these into a new synthesis. I think that's what's happening today and what needs to happen.
I wanted to start the interview with this quote that you have. Many of us can more easily envision the end of the world than we can envision the end of capitalism.
Isn't that wonderful?
Yeah. I mean,
yes.
So when you talk about us not owning a house, but you're also saying architecture?
Yeah. So, we know a lot about physical architectures and technological architectures, but social architectures, how do we organize ourselves to do things? And particularly in the economy, architectures of ownership and finance. Those are really the governing force. And most of us don't even understand those. We invest in our 401k and we know it goes into mutual funds, and those invest in companies, and companies produce earnings, and the earnings are related to share price. Most of us don't really understand all of this. We just rely on this architecture that's in place. And so I think what a lot of visionary activists really in the economy are doing is re-envisioning that. So they're talking about impact investing. So you invest for social and ecological impact alongside return. And there are some beginning funds that you can do that, and bonds and so forth where you can do that. Or reinventing companies. We talked about the DNA. So there are B Corps and there are employee-owned firms, and those are a different kind of model. So these different models are being developed, and we don't really need to understand them in great detail because, I don't really need to understand the internal combustion engine in great detail to just turn the key and drive away in my car. And I think what we need to do is to recognize, and this is what Ted Howard and I, my co-author, are trying to do in the making of a democratic economy, is to say these new forms, these models, these approaches, they're emerging, they're here, and they represent a coherent paradigm. It's the democratic economy. So let's recognize that this other way of organizing the economy is already emerging, and let's scale it up. Let's take it to scale. Let's grow it.
You say in the book, our economic system is broken. 71% of Americans believe the economic system is rigged against them. Mm-hmm. The real problem is we feel terrified by the scale of the problem and that we despair that anything can be done. The enemy to be overcome is our sense of futility, discouragement, and paralysis. And so what you're doing is you're creating the vision, and you're showing that it's possible and doing it so that people don't have to despair and they can have hope.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Rob. And so in every chapter we talk about, well, these are ordinary people who are doing this. In the Bronx, there are African American and Hispanic women working at Cooperative Home Care Associates. It's this large worker-owned firm. It's been around for more than 30 years. Employees own that firm. It's a worker-centered company. It exists to try to create good working conditions for these women, mostly women who have been largely left out of the economy. So these things are possible. And there's now a movement to take this kind of worker-owned home care company to scale. There's 15 of these companies now either in existence or in formation. And there's an annual meeting and people get together and say, how do we grow more of these? In every chapter, we talk about how would you scale this up? Like, let's just talk about employee ownership, for example. We're right now in a moment, Rob, where about 2 million businesses are going to be coming onto the market in the next decade as baby boom entrepreneurs retire. So they founded companies. What are they going to do with them? Are they going to sell them to a multinational? Are they going to sell to private equity? Are they going to close them down? Or could they sell them to employees? So we face this moment where you could bend the curve of history. You could say, let's make employee ownership the next big wave. Just like we, in the post-war era, we said broad-based ownership of homes is a national goal. We could say broad-based ownership of enterprise.
And there is government funding to help make this happen.
There are tax incentives already in place. Sellers can avoid capital gains taxes by doing this. Companies, if they're 100% employee owned as an S Corp, the company itself does not pay income tax at the company level because it's passed through to the owners who pay later when they retire. And so there are all these tax incentives in place. Yes, and there's new legislation saying the Small Business Administration should be telling owners about employee ownership. So, and there are banks, there's some funding, there's a whole technical infrastructure. There's a lot in place. If we decided to do this, it could be done.
The American Revolution was a revolution about government, but
right.
You specifically say that there was no revolution about the economy and a whole bunch of other things actually too.
Yeah, that's right. As I say it in the book, society long ago democratized government, but we have never democratized the economy. I mean, there was some early vision of broad-based participation. Thomas Paine had a vision of every man a proprietor. Thomas Jefferson had a vision of small landholders being the new ownership structure of the agrarian society. Now we know that these were very imperfect men, slave owners. Women didn't have the vote. Black people didn't have the vote. Black people didn't even own their own bodies. There was tremendous failure to reach their own democratic vision, but they nonetheless put in place a kind of a stream of democratic revolutionary spirit that has flowed far beyond their limitations. And we've seen women's rights. We've seen, of course, obviously the end of slavery. And now we're seeing a whole resurgence of Black Lives Matter and a new awareness of racism in our society. And so I think that getting beyond the extractive economy, getting beyond what I call capital bias, the system is organized for wealth holders. It's organized to create more capital for those who already have it. If we can get beyond that form of ism, we know about racism and sexism. There's also capitalism. There's this bias toward capital.
Talk about capital bias and what that is, and what is the resistance that you're getting, and how do you deal with the resistance to democracy economy?
We make the point in the book, Rob, that at the root, at the very social, I think, in values core of the extractive economy is what we call capital bias. It's this bias toward wealth holders. It's in values, it's in culture, and it's embedded in institutions invisibly. And so how do you get beyond that?
And I think, it's like Naomi Klein, who did the foreword to your book, the shock doctrine.
Yeah.
Friedman, his whole thing was everything is about the economy and everything is subordinated to this capitalist economy and profit.
This, capital bias, I've been hanging around business schools and the business press for decades. And you really see that it is the core of everything. We call it fiduciary duty, that investment managers have a duty to deliver maximum returns to shareholders. Corporations have been governed by what's often called shareholder primacy, that the shareholders come first. Only they have a seat in governance. Shareholders ostensibly elect the board and the board serves them, and you're supposed to maximize profit. When it's income to workers, that's called an expense, and you're supposed to drive it down as low as possible. When it's income to capital owners, it's called profit, and that's a good thing, and you're supposed to drive it up and have as much of it as possible. So this bias is built into the very structure of the income statement, which is how companies see the world. We want to pay workers as little as possible, and we want to pay shareholders as much as possible.
We need to take a brief break. And my guest for the show is Marjorie Kelly. She is the author of The Making of a Democratic Economy, Building Prosperity for the Many, Not Just for the Few. And she's Executive Vice President and Senior Fellow at the Democracy Collaborative. You're listening to the Rob Call Bottom Up Show, available on Pacifica Radio Network, Progressive Radio Networks, iHeartRadio, iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and at opednews.com/podcasts. I'm Rob Call, host of the show, which explores how we're transitioning from a top-down to a bottom-up culture and how to think about bottom-up. I've written a book, The Bottom-Up Revolution. Find out about it at robcall.com. You're listening to the Rob Call Bottom Up Show, available on Pacifica Radio Network, Progressive Radio Networks, iHeartRadio, iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and at opednews.com/podcasts. I'm Rob Call, host of the show, which explores how we're transitioning from a top-down to a bottom-up culture and how to think about bottom-up. I've written a book, The Bottom-Up Revolution. Find out about it at robcall.com. And my guest for the show is Marjorie Kelly. She is the author of The Making of a Democratic Economy, Building Prosperity for the Many, Not Just for the Few. And she's Executive Vice President and Senior Fellow at the Democracy Collaborative.
Bias is built into the very structure of the income statement, which is how companies see the world. We want to pay workers as little as possible. We want to pay shareholders as much as possible. That's just built into how they see the world. And then, of course, only shareholders have any power. So that's capital bias at work.
And that's a top-down way of thinking. It's a very linear approach that it totally ignores that a company exists within a system. And a systemic model is going to look at everybody.
Right.
Chomsky talks about externalities, and usually he's talking about the negative externalities that are not accounted for. But really, there's so much possibility for positive externalities too. And I think that like a worker-owned company offers so many possibilities that make it better for the community.
Absolutely, Rob. And we operate with these unconscious assumptions that hold in place the system as it is. For example, there's this notion that companies are objects that can be bought and sold. And that's how, if you're external to a company and you're an investor, that's how you see it. You know, you buy and sell companies all the time. But I think that what's emerging now is a sense that companies are actually human communities. It's a human community. And who's a member of that? Right now, workers are not considered members of corporations. They're hired hands. It's the shareholders who are the members. And employees are just an expense. They're hired hand, and you get rid of them as much as you can. Outsource work, fight unions, send jobs abroad, or bring in the robots. And so, you know, we have this system that, because of the unconscious picture we have in our head, shareholders are owners, companies are is an object. It is systematically trying to expel labor and labor income. And I don't just mean unions. I mean all labor. And that's a direct result of the system's design. And if we want, it's not an aberration. It's an outcome of what it's designed to do. So how do you design something different? Well, you know, we've been doing research, and I talk about this in the book, companies that are both benefit corporations and employee owned. So they have a purpose of public benefit, and they have broad-based ownership. We found more than 50 of these. And in the book, we talk about EA Engineering, which is one. And this is, it's an environmental consulting firm. For a time, it was traded on NASDAQ, and that virtually destroyed the company. And morale plummeted. They got in trouble with the SEC over cooking the books. They cycled through 3 presidents. The founder stepped in and bought it back, made it a benefit corporation and 100% employee owned, and it has returned to health and profitability because it has a living mission. This is a company that exists to serve life, and if you just turn it into an object in the stock market and just try to boost earnings every quarter, it virtually destroyed the life of this firm. So these living companies with public benefit, broad-based ownership, I think that's really the next generation of enterprise design.
Yeah, because really, when you create a company, you're creating a living system. And the living aspect of it changes the way you need to think about it, really.
Yeah, that's right.
And capitalism, it's vile, really, when it comes to the way it treats companies and workers.
Well, it's misguided. It's lost its way. The reason that it's lost its way is, I think, because of this over-influence of finance. We have a financialized economy. You can still have companies, you can still have investments, you can still have a lot of it. But if you take out this capital bias and say, no, this is now a democratic economy, it's about serving a variety of stakeholders, you can have a different system with different kind of outcomes. One person I was on, I've been on the radio a fair amount, Rob, and one person said to me, so what you're talking about then is tearing the whole system down and rebuilding a new one. And I said, no, actually not. It's not about tearing down. It's about removing this invisible bias. I mean, how did we deal with sexism when this first came up, in second wave feminism in the 70s and 80s? It didn't mean that you had to end all marriages. It just meant you had to recognize, no, they're equal partners here. This is not, one person subordinated subordinate to another. And I think it's very similar what needs to happen in our economy. We're not all subordinate to capital. Capital doesn't get all the wealth and the power, but you can keep a lot of the system intact and remove this bias.
When you talk about the idea of tearing everything completely apart, it makes me think of the human body and how every certain number of months, every cell in the body is replaced.
Oh, it's fascinating. Yeah.
Nature does that. And for us to totally replace our economic system, it wouldn't be with a totally new one, but it could be with a better one with lots of changes.
It could be a better one, and it could grow over time. We could have more democratic economy investments in companies and forms of economic development and purchasing. All of that could grow over time. And at the same time, we could place limits on the extractive model. For example, which is what the Accountable Capitalism Act envisions. You're no longer in the business of maximizing returns to shareholders. You're in the business of serving stakeholders. We could put that in place. So we could do this, Rob. We actually really could.
No, you are doing it.
Yeah, there's a whole movement of people doing it. We're trying to say this is actually a coherent movement. It's a coherent paradigm.
Now, you say that there are 7 principles of a democratic economy. And basically break the book down into chapters that demonstrate each of those.
Yeah, one of the things that system science tells us is that human social systems are organized around what we value. They're not organized around laws. They're not organized by a police state. It's what do you authentically care about that we want to organize ourselves around? I mean, right now it's organized around wealth. Financial wealth is the most important thing, the most valuable thing. Let's do everything we can to create financial wealth. That's the world that the robber barons basically put in.
And that's our culture. Our culture.
And it's our culture. Right.
Success is having a lot of money.
Right. It's very cultural. You're right. That's a lot of where it resides. But there are other things that we naturally care about, like sustainability, for example, ecological sustainability. So we talk about that in a chapter. And EA Engineering is one of the companies we talk about. This is a company designed to create more ecological resilience. And you can organize a company around that. We talk about inclusion. We know that we're heading in the next decade or two, we'll be a nation of a majority people of color. And yet people of color have systematically been not only left out, but prevented from participating in the economy and its prosperity. So we need inclusion. And we look at racial and gender inclusion. And we look at how economic development in the city of Portland, Oregon has completely reorganized itself around this aim. So inclusion, sustainability, democratic ownership, ethical finance, a community. Community is the root issue. And we're in this together. We're not rational economic man trying to make as much money as you can for yourself. No, we only exist in community, and that's what allows us to flourish. So these are the kinds of principles that I think that we are naturally, organically reorganizing ourselves around.
We were talking about Preston before. Tell us a lot more about Preston, because I think that story is pretty amazing. I mean, it started out, it was near the bottom economically.
It's a fascinating story. We're doing a lot of work in the UK because of what began in Preston. Yeah, this was a Rust Belt city, a lot like Cleveland, where we did our work with evergreen cooperatives. It was at one time the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. I think it was where the cotton spinning frame was invented. Over time, it became what was known as the suicide capital of England. It was so down and out. And as I mentioned earlier, Matthew Brown on the city council began looking around for, how could we help this city to prosper? They had tried to give tax incentives to attract a large corporation. That fell apart. So they said, well, we have to grow using our own assets, using our own resources. And they tapped what are called anchor institutions. And this is a lot of where our work is. Where are the big institutions that are not going to get up and leave? It could be a nonprofit hospital system. They looked at like the police system, the schools, and the city and the county. And they said, how can we localize our purchasing and our investment? They got the county pension fund to relocalize 100 million pounds of investment. And this was a big deal of the pension funds to bring that into the local economy and invest in reinvigorating local buildings and so forth. So they work to grow cooperatives. They're building some ethical banks there.
Is it a publicly owned bank?
Well, they could be cooperative banks.
What's the
not
difference?
not necessarily publicly owned, but organized for the public benefit, and a non-predatory payday lender. So if you're desperate and need some money at the end of your pay cycle, and you're late a couple of days with your payment, they're not going to jack up your interest rates. So they're putting in place lots of the elements of the democratic economy. And what has happened in Preston, this is the most remarkable thing, Rob, is that very recently, PricewaterhouseCoopers named Preston the most improved city in the UK. They have seen a reduction in poverty. They've seen a reduction in unemployment. The city was named one of the best places to live, rated better than London.
What do you attribute that to? What are the top three things that they did?
I think relocalizing anchor purchasing and investment. That has been huge. So if you're spending locally, that money tends to circulate 3 times more locally than if you're spending it, say, like in our case, it might be Walmart. You spend $1 there, and then that dollar leaves the community and goes to the owners and shareholders of Walmart. But if you're going to locally owned firms, then that money is going to recirculate more locally. So they relocalized hundreds of millions of pounds of purchasing. The city, I would say, number 2, declared itself a living wage city and made that the norm, across city institutions. And then I think the third is building democratic economy institutions of a variety of kinds.
Like what?
Like the ethical banks and worker co-ops. And sort of just, beginning to put in place these different kind of institutions.
You say that people make it like there's a binary choice between capitalism and socialism, and that these are 19th century constructs.
Yeah, that is such an important point. Where do we get this idea that our choice is binary, that it's either corporate capitalism or state socialism? I mean, people treat them like they're like sports teams. Go capitalism, go socialism. And I look at those and think those were invented in the 19th century. We're in the 21st century. We need something different that I think brings the wisdom of each of those and discards what doesn't work and creates a new synthesis. And that's the democratic economy. There will be, I think you need certain kinds of public ownership. For example, there is the Bank of North Dakota in the U.S. has been around for 100 years. Its purpose is to serve the people of that state, and it helped the whole state survive the 2008 downturn so well that there's now a movement for public ownership across the country, including the new governor of California.
That's public bank. And New Jersey, too.
Yeah, right. So you have these governors saying, I'm going to create a public bank. And there's a whole movement for that now. And that's just one form of public ownership. So yes, we do need certain forms of
and that ties in within the investment, because a public bank is going to take government pension funds and it's going to manage them, and it's going to take rainy day funds for big cities and states add up to billions of dollars. And they're paying maintenance fees to financial private institutions. And instead of paying maintenance fees, they're going to make interest, and they're going to be able to provide lower cost loans to local community businesses.
Yeah, you talk a lot about that in your book, Rob, and I loved that part. There's a couple of things we can see when you look at public banking, and it's very common across Europe, actually. Germany has a lot of public or cooperative banks. But what you can see is how much wealth is actually being extracted by finance unnecessarily, because you can have banks making loans at lower rates, still being profitable and returning profit to the city or the county or the state. So we begin to see how much wealth is being siphoned off by, the 1% and unnecessarily.
You talk about how this is not a partisan issue. This is not just something for Democrats. And I know public banking is something that is supported by both parties. Where does that fit in with your model?
Well, and also worker ownership is also supported by both parties. It's the only public policy that I know has been supported by both Ronald Reagan and Bernie Sanders. I mean, Ronald Reagan put in place a lot of the tax breaks that employee stock ownership plans enjoy today. And you're right. So in public banks is also supported by across the political aisle. So I think what we're talking about is an economy that actually works better for everyone. You can can still have investors. You can have investments that are more stable and less spiky. It works for workers who can have more stability. It works for communities who are not in this boom and bust economy. So I think what we're talking about is a superior way to organize an economy that's beginning to emerge.
Another thing is Medicare for all. If you take that out of the equation, paying for health care or having a job that provides health care is such a huge part of being a worker and being in the economy.
Yeah, it's really true. Yeah, I mean, I look at Medicare for all, and I think that's essentially saying that here's this sector of the economy, healthcare. It's too important to be left to the forces of extractive finance. Because when extractive finance gets a hold of it, they deny insurance coverage, they kick us out of the hospital after one night. So you don't want finance in charge of healthcare. It doesn't make sense as a way of organizing an economy. And so basically, healthcare is a public good, and it should be controlled in the public interest and not controlled by finance.
I love your concept of extractive economics, extractive finance. It's such an important concept because it really frames the kind of extractive capitalism. Mm-hmm. And I have the feeling that almost everything you're talking about, maybe everything you're talking about, could be done within a capitalist framework.
Well, you can call it capitalism. I tend not to engage in battlegrounds over words, but you can certainly have a modern economy that is organized around democratic principles. Yeah, I think you can definitely have that. And it's beginning now. The employee-owned companies, I mean, there's like thousands of them that exist now within a capitalist economy. So you're right. Bank in North Dakota exists within a capitalist economy. So these things are proven. They function today in today's world, and we can grow more of them at the same time that we can constrain the excesses of the system as it is.
It's kind of capitalism with compassion and empathy.
You can say that. I personally think we need to move beyond capitalism, because I go back to this notion of capital bias, Rob. Capitalism is a system organized for the benefit of financial capital. And so I think that we need to actually move beyond that system.
You got another word?
Democratic economy.
Democratic economy. Okay. My guest for the show is Marjorie Kelly. She is the author of The Making of a Democratic Economy, Building Prosperity for the Many, Not Just for the Few. Now, in your chapter 7, you explore the work of Carlos Santos Scandier, who was looking at buying the 25 largest U.S. fossil fuel companies. I love that concept, and I love how you compare it to the economic collapse of 2008, because the money's the same, right?
Yeah, it's an interesting concept. I mean, Carla is my brilliant colleague at the Democracy Collaborative. And she floated this idea in a contest run by some funders looking for ending the age of oil was their quest. And I think there were more than 500 submissions and 3 were selected for funding. And hers was one of those. And it's this out of the box idea. If companies like ExxonMobil and oil companies are the ones who are constraining the political system from being able to deal with climate change, let's just take them out of the way. Let's just step in and buy the 25 largest fossil fuel companies and wind them down. And you could do it using the same power that was used to bail out the big banks in 2008. And that's the power of the Federal Reserve to basically create new money. It's called quantitative easing. But it was done, you might remember Hank Paulson, Treasury Secretary, on his knees to Nancy Pelosi, begging for $800 billion in bailout for the big banks. And he got it in the blink of an eye. Well, you could buy 51% of the 25 biggest fossil fuel companies, the same figure, $800 billion, and begin to wind them down. So it could be done. And I think even as a thought experiment, Rob, what it says is what's constraining us from dealing with climate change really is the profit maximization motive inside these big companies. And we could change that overnight.
And the lobbying. And the other thing is, if we could pass laws that made it less attractive to be in the fossil fuel business, it would drastically decrease the value of those companies. And then they could be bought for a lot less.
You're right. And the value of those companies is going down. The energy sector declined, I think it was 25% in 2018. Coal companies already hit peak coal. So the demand for coal hits a peak and starts to decline basically in perpetuity. And there was a whole raft of coal company bankruptcies because of this peak coal. We're approaching peak oil. Some people put it, I think, at 2023. We're going to see a raft of bankruptcies. And so the question is, it may not be coming fast enough to save the planet. So we could step in in the public interest and wind them down faster.
Now, another thing is you talk about cooperative home care associates and how this company has changed the situation for home care health providers who usually are exploited and are paid terrible wages. How is it different with this company?
Minimum wage is only one intervention, but what if we actually had companies that were worker-centered companies? So not just saying we're going to force you to pay a minimum wage, but no, the whole company is organized around worker benefit. And that's the case with cooperative home care associates in the Bronx. It has about 2,300 workers who are going out into homes and caring for the elderly and the disabled and the poor. And it's not a high paying job because it's all controlled by Medicare. And so they are making $15 an hour, but they have seats on the board. They're unionized. The company has a policy of creating full-time work for them, where a lot of similar companies don't. They'll just use unstable contract part-time hours. So this company tries in every way that it can to benefit these workers. And I like this model because I think most of us don't even dream yet of a worker-centered economy. Most of us are workers. We're in a democracy. Our economy should be organized to benefit most of us, which means organized to benefit workers. And that really turns the economy on its head because right now it's organized to benefit capital and to do that by limiting income to workers.
And having this conversation, we shouldn't leave out the gorilla in the room, which is Mondragon. Because it kind of shows us how big things could get.
Mondragon is a federation of work-owned cooperatives in the north of Spain, in the Mondragon region. And there's over 100 worker cooperatives that are part of it. Now, it's a federation, so it's not like a conglomerate. They're not all owned by a single entity. Some of them are owned in a unified structure, but many of them have just decided to become worker co-ops and to adopt the same form, certain bylaws, certain rules that they operate by. And they have a bank that they own in common. They have their own welfare agency. They have a commitment to moving workers among companies if there's a need for layoffs so that people don't lose their jobs. And this has been around since the 1950s. How
big is it?
It's I think it's $13 billion in revenues. It's a quite substantial federation, and it's become the norm. People go to work for worker-owned companies, and they've been doing it for decades. It's really a wonderful thing to see.
So we need a wrap. Anything you want to finish up with?
I guess I would say, Rob, that there are a lot of technical questions to the democratic economy, but we don't need to get bogged down in that. I think the important thing to recognize is that it's possible to organize an economy in the modern age to benefit all of us. And we have models all over that show us how it can be done. And the time has come with great urgency that we need to make this the next system. And I think that's the task at hand.
And is there a website that you want to point people to?
You can go to democracycollaborative.org and check out our organization and find out about the book.
You got to look at my book, Bottom Up Revolution.
I have looked at it. I think it's great, Rob. I really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you. Are there specific bottom-up angles to your work that we haven't touched on yet?
Well, I think the whole notion of bottom-up ownership is really critical to building a democratic economy. I mean, there's the notion that everyone can be owners. It's not just a few. I think that's really critical. I think also, you talk about how the growth of civilization and the movement of civilization over time, that we're really getting back to natural values, the organic kind of values of how life itself functions, cooperation. Yes, there's competition, but cooperation is also there. I think one of the insights I had reading your book, Rob, was how, we're seeing the tremendous growth and dominance of these bottom-up organizations they're bottom up in certain ways of functioning, like Google and like Facebook and all these tech platforms. And I think the reason that they're spreading is because there is this new ability to connect with each other without an intermediary dictating it, and that's natural to us, and so it's spreading organically. But I think what the problem is that what's in place is the archaic ownership structure. So you have a founder becoming a billionaire by owning this infrastructure that I think naturally would belong to all of us. And you talk about it's a clashing of two worlds that we're going to have to figure out somehow how to move beyond that. But yeah, you talk about platform cooperatives and how that's an emerging new model where there's broad-based ownership of these kinds of platform companies. And I think that's a really important trend to point to.
I also talk about making it illegal to be a billionaire, which finally more and more people are talking about. For years, it was Tom Hartman and I talking about it, but now a lot of people are coming out saying it.
I loved that line. I think the first thing we should do is we should make it shameful to be a billionaire. You should be embarrassed to be a billionaire. And that would create the conditions that you could begin maybe make it illegal.
Like I say in my book, in indigenous cultures, they would treat somebody who hoards 50% of the resources as either crazy or evil. And
I think you're right. You also say that we should end corporate personhood. I think that's right. But then you have to ask yourself the next step, well, what do you put in place then? And I think what you put in place is the democratic ownership, democratic design of companies. It's what I call next generation ownership. And I think broad-based ownership with benefit corporation purpose in place. I think that's what comes next. And so rather than having companies pretend that they're individuals and claim, free speech rights, you have to create the governing structure for the kind of company that we want. And I think we're starting to see examples of that.
Well, I love your work. You're doing great stuff, and keep it going.
Rob, I feel such kinship with your thinking. Thank you so much for sharing your book. The bottom-up revolution really changed my way of thinking. It's eye-opening on so many levels. I recommend it to everyone.
Thank you so much.
It's been great fun talking today.
We've got to do it again. It was 4 years, maybe sooner the next time. And my guest for the show is Marjorie Kelly. She is the author of The Making of a Democratic Economy, Building Prosperity for the Many, Not Just for the Few. And she's Executive Vice President and Senior Fellow at the Democracy Collaborative. You're listening to the Rob Call Bottom Up Show, available on Pacifica Radio Network, Progressive Radio Networks, iHeartRadio, iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and opednews.com/podcasts. I'm Rob Call, host of the show, which explores how we're transitioning from a top-down to a bottom-up culture and how to think about bottom-up. I've written a book, The Bottom Up Revolution. Find out about it at robcall.com.